Welcome everybody. Tonight, M Chapter is happy to bring you a discussion with the current chairman of Club Racing, Scott Reiman, and the director of the Club Race School, Wayne Dobson. I'll be your host. You'll only see me for a few minutes. My name is David Gilardi, and I've been part of BMW CCA for almost 30 years, believe it or not. I know I don't look that old, but so be it. Before we start with tonight's program, I just wanted to make a couple of reminders. We have another event coming up on March 23rd. Let's Talk M-Cars with EAG. The CEO of EAG will be on to talk about what they do. They are, if you will, restorers extraordinaire, and they are very focused on some of the earlier M-Cars. That's on March 23rd at 8 p.m. and you can sign up at Motorsport Reg, where most of our other events are noted. Then after that, if you go to mx1.bmwcca, you can see the event that's taking place April 9th to 11th. Down in rear, there is a whole host of activities, and I would make special note of the caravans that will be forming to head down. If you're interested, at that website, there are contact names if you want to join up and drive down. I think there's 3 caravans, one from sort of what I would call the Midwest, but I live in New York, so anything on the other side of the Hudson River is Midwest to me. There's a northern route and there's a southern route as well. With that, I would also mention that those of you who are BMW CCA members, feel free to join M Chapter. Right now, most of our events are available to anyone, and not just CCA members, but that may change in the future. We are planning additional webinars, and you'll always see those on our private Facebook page, on our website, and of course, we'll usually announce them on Motorsport Reg for signing up and what have you. So with that, let's get started. What I'm going to do is disappear, but you'll hear me as we go along. I'm going to act as sort of an interviewer. I do invite you to use the question box if there are things that we haven't covered or questions that you have that were potentially not answered clearly, or you're a little confused. Feel free to use the question box and I will either answer them or I will put them in the questions that I ask of both Scott and Wayne. So with that, Scott, I'd like to start with you. If you could give us a little bit of the history of BMW CCA Club Racing, that would probably be a good place to start.
David, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk with everybody tonight. We like to say that since we're entering year 26, that we're just starting our second 25-year stint in club racing. The program was founded really by Scott Hughes and his wife Fran. They were members of the New Jersey chapter at the time, and it struck them that I think with the tradition in the Jersey chapter having had an early start in driving school participation, that the next natural step was to provide a venue for racing. So in I guess it was 25 years less 2020, so that must have been 1985. They got I'm sorry, 95. They got started with a series of a half dozen races that spanned the country. And the first race was in Florida at what was then called Moroso, which is now, I think, Palm Beach International Raceway. And the roundel, just like today, covered the first race. And there was a quote that was in the magazine that I think appropriately captures what's happened since. This was somebody named Klaus Schnitzer, so some of you who've been around a long time might remember Klaus. His words in the rondel were, trying to get people to speak coherently after the race was difficult. Many were too excited to talk. So I think that captures a bit of our history, Dave.
Yeah. Great, super. Scott, it always seems appropriate when we're talking about something new, so I'm going to call it new. I'm going to bridge off your first 25, second 25. What is the philosophy of BMW club racing, and how might it be different from other venues?
Well, I think that's a great question. And of course, today, there's no shortage of ways to get a car onto a racetrack. I think the way to think about BMW CCA club racing and how it's differentiated is to recognize that after every event, we hand out a flag. It's a logo of the club, and every driver signs it and indicates their car number and the class that they've run in. And that's awarded to somebody in the paddock who demonstrated, based on the steward's viewpoint, the best demonstration of the spirit of club racing. And so we like to think that that makes us kind of special, because the camaraderie in the paddock. There's you can find on the website and other places within the BMW CCA organization what the full wording is of the spirit of club racing. But I think the key words are founded on the belief that the fun and friendly competition is more important than the results, and that mutual assistance among racers enhances the experience for everyone. I think that, from my perspective, having done this since 2004, that kind of captures it for me.
That's great. Thank you for that. Now, Wayne, alongside the club race program itself, there's also a race school. Can you give us a few words on its history? And later on, we'll talk about where you're headed with it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. So the club race schools are sort of an integral part of club racing, and the race schools, just like the club racing, got started by Scott and Fran Hughes. The school itself started about 15 years ago, and it was really in a response to a need to better prepare and orientate people to what racing was like before they actually get out there on the track and did racing, and to do that in a sort of controlled, safer environment. So Scott and Fran started the club race school, and that school has continued ever since then, basically trying to teach the advanced skills necessary to be a successful person in club racing.
Okay, great. Wayne, we might have lost you at the last comment. Did we lose your voice there for a minute?
Oh. I'll just repeat that. So, what our schools do is teach the advanced skills necessary to be successful in getting into club racing. And obviously, if you pass our schools, you can then apply for a club racing license with BMW.
Okay, great. Thank you. Scott, use your own experience. What would you say is the most traditional path for someone to get into club racing, and how did you do it?
I think the most prevalent approach, David, is you've been going to DEs. Typically, these are sponsored by BMW CCA chapters, but they don't have to be. And as you've progressed, you start to see the opportunities to add some competitive juice to the program. I mean, for those of us that have been on the track for a while, you may have moved up into the instructor ranks, and that group is, supposed to be operating on a point-by basis, and most of the time that happens. But there are occasions when there's an opportunity to put your car where you want it to be, and you just get this flavor that says, this could be pretty fun if we were wheel-to-wheel racing. So I started going to DEs in 2004, and as often occurs, you end up with a group of buds. And one of the guys that I was going to schools with said, "Hey, why don't we go to race school?" And I didn't have a race car at the moment. I thought, well, that would be a bit of a stretch. And events conspired to allow me to obtain a race car. And so I was doing events in that car, and the race school came up. And so I said, well, fine, I'm gonna take that. So I went to Watkins Glen with my co-conspirator, and we took part in the 2-day school and then raced that same weekend. And that is not always the typical path. I might have been a little bit of an early adopter, but typically I think the race school program is the way to graduate from HPDE into a race environment.
Okay, great. We'll come back to HPDE later. We'll probably need to spend a few minutes on that, only because some of our participants on the call are not doing HPDE, much less club racing. So we'll come back to that. Wayne, can you talk a little bit about the requirements to get into race school, since it sounds like it's a necessary path on the way to club racing, or at least a preferred path. So what do you need to do to get into race school?
Yeah, so basic requirement is some demonstrated driving proficiency from driving schools. And typically, it could be a BMW club, DE, high performance driving school, or the equivalent. There are several organizations that provide track time. There's Hooked on Driving, Track Time. The Porsche clubs, the Audi clubs, all have some sort of driving school activities on track. So typically, we look for a minimum of about 10 school days. So for people who are thinking about that, that's usually like 5 events, because they're typically 2 or 3 day schools. And you should have achieved the advanced run group status. And we prefer we prefer to have some references. We need like your HPDE chief instructor reference, or one of the driving school instructors you had, or other club racer. But basically, you need to have some performance driving skills before going to the school, because we then build on those skills to show you what it would be like to be on the track in a race environment.
Okay, thank you, Wayne.
Yeah.
Wayne, you went into club racing yourself after some amount of time, I assume, in a DE. So what was your path like?
Well, my path started out with BMW high performance driving schools at Watkins Glen. I had a 2001 C3 M Roadster, and I grew up in Watkins Glen. And for any people out there who don't know where Watkins Glen is, it's in upstate New York, and it's home to the best racetrack in North America. Of course, I am a little partial. So I went to that DE, and at that point I was hooked. It was so much fun that I just continued doing BMW driving schools, went through the beginner level, intermediate level, advanced. But really what sort of got me was I was intrigued by the fact that there was always something new to be learning in a driving skill, or there was always a challenge to become better or better at a driving skill. So for me, club racing was just a progression along the path of learning new driving skills and getting better and better at it. So I attended a club race school at Mosport in 2011, and then started racing a couple years later.
Okay, great, thank you. Scott, can you focus a little bit on safety? There are lots of race venues out there, and some of them have a reputation. Some are good and some aren't so good. So talk a little bit about BMW CCA racing philosophy with regard to safety.
So I think that's a great question, David. I'll relate something that I heard recently from the Lockton Affinity Group. So they're the people who write insurance for track events, and they support BMW CCA's programs because of the safe reputation that both driving schools and club racing have. That comes kind of fundamentally from excellence in instruction, from my perspective. I'm a product of driving schools within BMW CCA, as is Wayne, and I think the program starts with good fundamentals for the driver, and then the rules support safe operations. We're usually at the leading edge of club programs from a safety equipment standpoint. We were one of the first to require head and neck restraint equipment. That wasn't always completely popular because it drives some cost, but I think the focus from an equipment standpoint is always on safety. And the other element is that we run with what are called 1313 vintage rules, which fundamentally means that if you're involved in an incident where you made an error and had contact, and that can be with another car, but also can be with something immovable like a wall, unassisted, so to speak, there'll be a penalty and likely a probationary period. And a second infraction while under probation leads to a suspension, and the rules allow for up to 13 months of either probation or suspension, which is where the name comes from. And most vintage racing organizations run that way. Others like NASA or well, there are so many different splinter groups nowadays from a racing standpoint. But broadly, NASA and others don't have quite the same level of focus from a stewarding and penalty standpoint that club racing does.
Scott, just a sort of a follow-up on that. A lot of things have rules. Are these rules adhered to? In other words, would you say that the 1313 is a serious rule and infractions will in fact mandate some attention on the part of racing officials?
Yes. So, one of the big challenges in an all-volunteer organization, well, really in any volunteer or any organization where you have a good number of people involved, and at last count, we had close to 50 volunteers that helped put on our program. Consistency is a key element of our activity. And so those rules are carefully curated. Change isn't done without careful consideration. And we do, I think, a reasonably good job of managing to those rules. There are always opportunities to disagree with that, particularly if you've been penalized. There is an appeals process, and it is a self-correcting system at the end of the day. So I think we always are aspiring to continuously improve, but there's a strong focus on being consistent in how we manage to our rule set.
Okay. And underneath that, I'm assuming that there is a philosophy that contact is always bad.
Yes. It's an interesting observation. We had a club race at Watkins Glen. Again, I would just emphasize that's Wayne's favorite track in case you didn't recognize that, which is perhaps my favorite track too. But anyway, we had 5 rookies taking part who had been to the race school at the same facility a few months earlier. This was last fall, and I surveyed just those rookies to say, how did our experience compare with your expectations? And broadly speaking, they said it was much more intense, and I didn't expect contact because in the school you say there is no tolerance for contact. And the problem is physics is part of the program. We've all who have had on-track experience recognize that debris gets on the track, sometimes coolant, sometimes oil, sometimes it's wet, sometimes it's cold, sometimes there are mechanical things that happen to the car. So it's important to say, we don't have zero contact. We encourage driving to focus on zero contact And in fact, this year we're doing some new things with safety messaging throughout the season to try to help drivers and their awareness.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Wayne, my understanding is that although club racing has a set of rules in terms of what the car needs to be outfitted with, and we'll come to that later, the race school is a little bit different. Can you talk about that, why that is, and what is, what do I need? If I want to do race school, can I show up in a rented Hyundai Elantra?
Sure you can. I don't think I've ever seen that before. But the basic difference for why the cars don't need to be fully race cars is because it's a school. So any car that's suitable for use in, like, say, a BMW club driving school can be used for the club race schools. You don't need a prepared race car, and we allow any manufacturer's models. Those cars are welcome. So even the car that you were planning to rent would be fine. but in my opinion, the best car to bring to a club race school is a BMW M car. It's the perfect choice.
Got it. Okay, good. Scott, I want to go back now and talk a little bit about what is the nature of the preparation to bring a car to a BMW club race event. What is absolutely required, regardless of class or any of those other happy things?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, David. I mean, we certainly encourage BMWs to participate with us, but it is possible to bring your Hyundai as long as it had a roll cage and all of the other safety equipment. And I think that's really the consistent expectation across all classes. We have sport class, prepared class, modified classes, and additionally there are some what we call spec classes. The consistent theme throughout is the safety preparation. A roll cage is a requirement, and there are some fairly specific expectations about how that cage is built and installed in the car. A fire system is required. We require a rain light. The driver safety equipment is specified at a fairly high level. There are nets in the car, which are also date specific as to their condition. The whole idea is that if we know that there's something that will provide a safer platform to operate in, it's our obligation to properly consider, decide upon the cost consequences, and if there are cost consequences, we'll advertise with good notice. It may take a year for us to implement a new requirement, but I think we're fairly well positioned with a lot of expertise on our leadership team that brings us a good focus on safety, and that is the overarching expectation across all cars that compete with us.
Okay, great. Can you go back and I was going to come to this later, but you introduced it, so I want to go back. Give us a little bit of help in understanding the class structure, because, you go to a club race, and I've been to many, as the cars flash by, you see all kinds of letters and numbers and what have you. So can you just give us a little bit of a rundown on the basics of the class structure for club racing?
Sure. Generally speaking, the spec classes are the first place that I'd start, because I think oftentimes that's one of the more affordable entrees. The spec classes, it's an E36 chassis or an E46 chassis, and still today E30 as a platform that are specified. And the good news about spec classes is that they cross into other organizations without a lot of muss and fuss. So if you built a spec E46, it's actually a set of rules that's consistent across multiple organizations, and that's a very popular and growing class for us today. E36 also has a spec class. That was one of the first forays for BMW Club Racing to build a rule set associated with a class, and that's also popular. And the Spec E30 class is the grandfather of the program in spec racing, and again, those rules are shared across multiple organizations. Within BMW Club Racing, the specific classes for us include, as I mentioned before, sport, and there's, generally speaking, a power to weight gradation that says if you've got a chassis, let's say it's an E36 chassis 3 Series car that you want to position in sport, the rules allow for very modest modification. Without going into all the detail, it's again a low-cost approach. And the I-Sport class, which is a power to weight that essentially is modeled around the E36 M car, that is a very popular entry-level class. When you move to prepared, then more significant internal engine modifications are allowed. Again, remember the safety requirements are consistent across all platforms. The engine requirements, therefore, are a little bit more liberal. There's some aerodynamic aid that's allowed, and that then moves you up both in speed, but also in cost. And then the last tranche of classification is modified, which essentially says if it's a BMW chassis and a BMW engine, you can mix and match, whatever you feel is going to give you the most advantage, with more flexibility in the aero rules, braking rules. It's essentially an unlimited budget category that a lot of people will gravitate to as they grow in the program.
And there is something called super modified as well. Does that sit on top of modified, or is it part of?
Yes. Thank you for the reminder. A few people will bring perhaps historic race cars from other series that don't actually fit even within our mod class. Sequential transmissions is, for instance, a differentiator. You can't have a sequential trans in a mod class so that you would be moved into supermod. And oftentimes it's not a heavily populated class, but it brings out some interesting hardware.
Okay, cool. So at some level, the way you described it, as you go up the class structure, it requires more spondulics to get there.
Yes, that's, as we were saying before the call started, if a track unit is $200, mucho track units are required in mod.
Great, thank you for that. Wayne, I want to come back to race school for a minute. I know it's a pathway to club racing. We've talked about that. How else is it traditionally used other than as a byway on the path to club racing? What else do you think it's good for?
Yeah, I mean, a large number of our students who go through the club race school don't end up going into club racing. But the race school itself, I think, it's great for expanding your driving skills beyond, excuse me, typically what you would find at a driving school level, especially in the area of situational awareness, what's going on around you. And also in reading or anticipating what cars are going to be doing around you. As a matter of fact, I typically continue to use those skills that I learned in the club race school all the time in my routine driving. You're just more aware of what's going on around you at the street, and you can sort of, you develop this instinct of what this car around you is going to end up doing. In fact, when I did my club race school at Mosport, I didn't have any immediate plans to go racing. It was just another step in learning more about driving schools. And probably even the most end point is it's just a lot of fun.
Okay. Great. I have noticed that some of the more advanced driving schools, of which I've been a long participant in, because I've never gone club racing, but I've been on track since almost 25 years, as a matter of fact. Talk a little bit about the structure of a high performance driving school, as sort of as the starting point, if you will, for someone wanting to go into club. How is it different? How is it the same? Talk a little bit about the whole HPDE structure, if you can.
Sure. So first of all, the HPD, high performance driving education, the BMW clubs chapters have been doing those schools around the country at road courses since the 1970s. And the purpose of these schools are to, first of all, teach you key performance driving skills that are directly applicable to everyday driving in the street. So at the beginner level, if you go to a driving school, they'll teach you the importance of looking further ahead and soft vision focus, and teach you some of the basic car dynamics that affects tire traction. And all of this is directly applicable to the street. And then they'll develop skills that are more performance orientated, and they do it all in a controlled environment that's safe. And so your typical driving education school is a 2 or 3 day event. It has classroom instruction and then also on-track instruction with an instructor. Historically, the instructor rode in your car. Last year with COVID, we did a lot of lead follow and so forth, but hopefully this year, a lot of the clubs are hoping to get back into either in-car instruction again. So you also learn these skills in groups that are like skills altogether. So they'll typically run a novice group, an intermediate group, and an advanced group. So depending on your experience and how many days you've gone to these schools, you typically start out in a novice group and then advance up through intermediate and advanced.
Great.
But there is, I have one caution for anybody who's thinking of going to these schools. They are addictive. You will get hooked.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, it's sort of a never-ending problem. It's an incurable disease once you get started.
Oh yes.
Very great. Okay, good. Thank you very much for that, Wayne. Scott, if I now turn my attention back to a race event or a race weekend, how is it typically structured? So you talked about an awful lot of classes of cars. Obviously, I mean, typically, I know you don't take the track for every minute of every day by and large. Talk a little bit about what is the structure of a club race.
Sure thing. One of the complexities, I guess, if you will, of club racing is that we have a central organization that provides stewards and infrastructure, but in almost all cases, BMW CCA Club Racing has a partner at the racetrack. So coming up, for instance, we've got 2 events in early April. One is a race school at Pit Race, and we have a non-BMW partner for that event. And so Wayne and his team will be working with some non-CCA folks. The VIR race that's coming up, the Tar Heel chapter is leading the charge, but we actually are racing with a vintage group at that event. So that's an often times a means of creating an opportunity for us to have a slice of track time, as you mentioned, David. But the majority of our events, I think it's still fair to say, a BMW CCA chapter will have a driving school going on and also will sponsor a race. And so typically many months before the event, on MSR, the same place you would have registered to take part tonight, the event will be described and you'll have an opportunity to sign up. So you need to be a licensed racer in order to register. You need to also be a BMW CCA club member. That might not be too surprising. And your car and all of its details are in the system. So when you sign up, you have the opportunity to specify the car. If you have a feast of riches and have more than one race car to choose from, well, that'll be in your menu options. Most of us don't have that option. So, for instance, for this VIR race, I went on a few weeks ago and I signed up to race and I put my credentials in, and now the Tar Heel chapter, who's running registration, has all my details. And as a racer, I can go on to MSR and look at the entry list. So I've watched the number of entries increase. We have 61 racers at last count going down to VIR, of which in my class IP, there are 9 other competitors, 22 Spec E46s, I think 12 iSport cars, and a variety of others. So it's kind of interesting to watch who your competitors are. And if you've done this a while, not only are you interested in whether they're going to be there, but then you're working your strategy to decide, well, how am I going to beat that son of a gun this time?
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. Wayne, since we've talked a little bit about the cars, how about you just give us a little description of what it is that what is your race car, and what class is it in, and what kind of modifications, and just, a little bit of history, because I've noticed a lot of racers tend to change cars rather frequently, but my understanding is you've been racing that same car for a while.
Yes, I have. 7 years. So I race in the iSport class, which Scott mentioned. It's typically an E36 M3, and my car is a 1995 M3, which TC Klein built. TC built actually 3 IS cars, and I think mine's the last one. Other cars have moved on. I know one went to IP, and I'm not quite sure where another one went. So, but
Yeah.
But I chose the sport class because it fit my balance between cost and performance. The sport class allows the suspension modifications, so you can make an M car handle even better. But engine, there's no modifications allowed to engine, drivetrain, brake calipers. They're all stock. No wings, no aero. So basically, you're not spending money on those types of modifications. I picked iSport because it's kind of a middle of the pack type of class. So you typically get to do a lot of passing, and you are being passed during the race. And quite frankly, that's part of the excitement and the fun of racing. And there's currently quite a few iSport cars out there. I think Scott just mentioned there was 12 scheduled for VIR. So normally I have several people in my class to race with. I enjoy that class.
Okay, great. And of course, you know that my son owns one of the other TC Klein prepared iSport, but he's moved his up to IP.
Yes, that's the one that's gone to IP. I do have the rare photo of all 3 of TC Klein's iSport cars at New Jersey Lightning. We were all there together and went in the parking lot and took the photo. Yeah.
Wow. Were they built at the same time?
They were all built within about a year of each other. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. So Scott, let's go back to, if I looked at the group of cars showing up for any given club race, aside from class, what kind of car would I find? Is it, a bunch of Z3s, or is it a bunch of brand new M cars, or what would I find if I looked closely?
No Hyundai Elantras. So I think we're in a bit of a transition as the E36 chassis starts to age a little bit. And it's not that they're aged, it's just that when people start to build a new car today, they may not choose an E36. We still have E30 M3s out there, if you can believe that, although they must have some pretty good financial wherewithal to be able to take that risk. But there are a handful that we see pretty regularly on the racetrack, and that's a great thing to see, of course. I'm not complaining. I'm just remarking that I'm not sure I would do it that way. E46 today, both the M chassis and the non-M in the spec series is I think the predominant chassis today by a small margin. And the way I judge that, my car is a 95 M3 as well in IP, so I've got some aero and brake changes that are a little different than Wayne's car. But when I started racing, I chose that class because it was the most popular. And it was pretty typical that I would see 15 or more competitors at a big VIR event like is coming up. And that's softened a little bit as the chassis has aged. And today, HP, which is the E46 M3 platform, is more popular. We also see a smattering of E92s. They have some challenges from a race management standpoint. There's a fair amount of complexity in the engine control systems, and you know the CAN bus in those cars are not as friendly to work on as hardwired vehicles. Although of course the 46 still has got some early stage CAN bus to work with. And you know we are seeing some factory built race cars, the 235 iRacing, 240 iRacing, and there was a competitor at Road Atlanta last month in an M2 CS racing. So we do see some factory cars coming our way. It's not the most popular approach because, of course, it is the most spendy approach. But it's nice to see. And again, I think people who have spent a lot of money on a car, they like the 1313 vintage rules. They like our approach to trying to manage to minimize and limit contact and have consequences when it does occur.
Okay, great. Super, thank you. And just by happenstance, my track car, which is not a club race vehicle, happens also to be an E36 M3, although it's a later 97 sedan, which makes it somewhat unusual. Although the other, well, what was the third TC Klein? Was it a coupe or a sedan? Because Kevin's is a sedan as well.
Yes, it was a sedan. My car was the only coupe.
The only coupe. Interesting.
Yep.
So, interesting. Wayne, at one time, and maybe you still are, you started in driving schools, you became an instructor at some point, you did club race. Talk a little bit about instructing. You know, what's that like? How did you decide to do that? Are you still doing it? Talk a little bit about the whole instructing side of this.
Sure. Yes, I graduated from the BMW instructor training school in 2011. And I've been instructing at BMW HPDEs ever since. The one thing that just dawned on me, we've talked about high performance driving schools, and now I mentioned I graduated from instructor training school, and we have club racing schools. just to toot our horn a little bit, BMW has the best instruction out there, I believe, of any other club organization. So. But I've been a club racer and an instructor. Once I became a club racer, I also started coaching at our club racing schools, and I continue to do HPDs, and I've always been interested in the club racing school coaching also. I just enjoy the teaching. It's so rewarding to see people learning a new skill and getting better at it. And it's a way of giving back. I mean, heaven knows I got a lot of instruction from lots of different instructors over the years. And in order to continue this sport, we just need interested people to keep coming and learning these new skills.
Yeah, great. That's super. You make a great point on the give back. I've also been the beneficiary of lots and lots of, I cannot tell you the number of club racers who have been in my right seat, or interestingly enough, where I've been in their right seat when they were coming up through the HPDE ranks. So it's really kind of cool to see that happening. That's a great thing. We talked about HPDE. Scott, I wanted to go to a new topic that we haven't talked about yet, and I know it's part of the overall club racing program, and that's time trials. Can you give us a few words on time trials? I know they're relatively new. What's that all about?
So great question, David. I think from a perspective of what's different about a time trial compared to a driving school, typically it's an advanced student, might be an instructor who would be interested in a time trial. And as the title suggests, we're gonna be looking within the class that you're operating in to see how you do from a time standpoint. So your objective is to get a clean lap. We'll typically send a timing and scoring steward, which means you've got to either provide or rent a transponder. So every racetrack that we operate on has got a timing and scoring loop. So when the car passes over the loop, there's an inductive coupling with your transponder, and that gives the timing and scoring folks an understanding to the 100th of a second, or is it 1,000th of a second, Wayne? It's pretty finely sliced to ensure that we know how you did. And the classing is generally fairly simple. It'll probably be based on power to weight from a factory standpoint. This program for BMW Club Racing started with the Rocky Mountain chapter who got underway with the program, and now they have essentially seeded the cloud. A guy named Gary Bond is our director. So like Wayne, he's responsible for the time trial program. Last year with COVID, we ran only a handful. I think there were 3 events. This year we have 6 or 7 on the schedule. And I think if you're a track driver, if you regularly attend driving schools, you might ask your organizers about whether they would be interested in a time trial, because club racing would love to put one on. It's relatively low overhead. It doesn't take us a lot of effort to put it on the schedule. We do our working on a classroom program to try to give some pointers, because it actually is a bridge between, again, advanced driving and instructing within a driving school environment and club racing, with the race school sitting kind of on a complementary basis side by side with it.
Okay, great, super. So I've seen a couple of questions that I'm going to ask each of you to give us some perspective on. There are a number of people on the call that are asking about crossover from other organizations. So can I leverage my experience with PCA or with Hooked on Driving? How can I use that? So when I come to BMW CCA, do I have to start at the bottom and progress up through the ranks, or can I take advantage of what I've already demonstrated, my competency? Talk a little bit about how you deal with that in the club racing environment and the race school environment, et cetera.
So maybe I'll start it off and then hit the ball to Wayne.
Okay, great.
The pathways to getting a license with club racing, broadly, there are 2 choices. One is you've had race experience elsewhere. You might be a license holder, or you might have run with a series that isn't so focused on licensure. AER comes to mind, or WRL. Lemons, not so much. That a little bit less professionalism there. So if you're interested in racing with us, you can apply for a license, and we'll check your credentials. Typically, somebody from another series, PCA, NASA, somebody who holds a license with those organizations will apply. We'll look at their background, we'll talk to their references, and we'll definitely confirm that their medical meets our requirements. That's one method, but Wayne's going to describe a little bit more detail on, if you go to race school and want to race, how does that turn into a license?
Yeah, so even just, sort of qualifying for a race school, I say we're looking for someone who has, advanced driving school skills. And ideally, BMW driving schools, it helps us know that you've gotten some really good instruction. But if you've gone through PCA or Audi Club, or anybody who puts on track time or track schools, just include that as part of your resume. When you apply for a club race school, we also ask for a driving resume. How many driving schools have you gone to? What tracks have you gone to? Have you been signed off solo? And then we ask for some references. So yes, you don't need to start from ground zero if you've been, been on the track with somebody else. Just provide your driving resume. We'll do some checking of your references. And, if things are, basically we're looking for, do you have enough driving skills that you're going to be comfortable doing our school? We don't want people that are so overwhelmed that it's just not a good experience for them.
Yeah, David, maybe I could just jump in with one other comment about the race schools, and that's that the coaches that are there are all licensed BMW drivers. And there's kind of an undercurrent of expectation that says to graduate, we all have to be comfortable that we could race with you. Right. And I think that's, that's our preferred path for entry. It's not the only path, but that's our preferred path for entry.
Okay. Good. All right. We are getting close on time, but I wanted to cover really one or two more short topics. Talk a little bit about the opportunity for people to volunteer, because another way to participate is to volunteer. So Scott, I'll start with you. What are the ways that people can volunteer and at least, get up close and personal with the whole racing program without necessarily racing yourself?
Yeah, we'd love to have anybody who's interested join us in the paddock. Typically, the race chair for an event is listed on MSR. So if you saw a race on the schedule, and you can see the schedule in its totality on our website, but if you saw a race that was close to you that worked and you wanted to investigate, MSR will list the event exclusively. You can find who's the race chair, the person running the event, and contact them. And failing that, reach out to Wayne or myself, and we'll connect you, because it's a great way to learn a bit about what the events are. There can be some pretty interesting things that happen in a race too, from a competition standpoint. So it's a good thing to spectate as well.
Okay. And Wayne, anything to add from a race school perspective?
Yeah, the only thing I could add is, depending on which part of the country and what your local BMW club, whether or not they, organize and put on track events. But if your local club does do that, get a hold of your local club. When they put on a track event, they would love to have people come, help in the pits, help set up cars before a race. As Scott mentioned, both club races and the club race schools typically happen in conjunction with a local club driving school. So, the driving school people need people in the pits to control cars going in and out of the track, as do the race school and the club racers.
Okay, great, super. I want to end with just a quick question to both of you. In terms of, you're both newly in your roles. Scott, sometime I think late in 20, you assumed your role as chairman of club racing, and Wayne, you're even newer in your role for the race school. Let me start with Scott. Where are you trying to take club racing? If you could just give us a couple of, points of view or sentences or directions where you'd like to take it.
Yeah, David, I think that's a great question. And we're certainly informed by our last 25 years of experience, and it's a more competitive environment as to where you can take your car and get on the racetrack today. So we've established, kind of a mission that says that we want to make our events consistent. We want to make sure that we're competitive. And that means both on the track and against our other series that we are striving to really beat in the marketplace. We want to make our events exciting. And so sometimes that's not just on the racetrack, it's in the paddock. And we want to make it easy to participate, within reason. We can't just let that Elantra rental driver show up and race with us. But we do want to make sure that, the backstory, the information about our program is easy to access, that we're accessible, that we're able to get you registered if you're qualified and on the track with a minimum of fuss. And I think that's kind of our competitive brief today. How do we win in today's environment? And that's what we're committed to.
Okay. And Wayne, anything from a race school perspective you would like to add or comment?
Sure. Yeah, I was fortunate to have inherited a pretty sophisticated and well-developed club race school program. Thank you, Scott.
Well, and other predecessors, not just me.
Oh well, yes, but you're the one that I got it from last. So, but yeah, basically with the club race schools, we're looking to sort of consistently be improving things. So we're always looking at our curriculum, making little tweaks here and there based on the survey results that we get from our students. So I mean that's where we're always sort of focused on. Last year with club race schools, with COVID restrictions, it was a tough year. I'm hoping this year we get back to a little bit more situation of little or no restrictions on the track. So that's sort of the focus this year. The other thing I'm looking for going probably mainly next year, most of our schools tend to be east of the Mississippi. I know this year we have one school that's at High Plains Raceway outside Denver. So anybody in that part of the country, go take a look at that school. But I'm already starting to think about how we can get more of our schools into the western part of the U.S.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to thank Scott and Wayne for just packing us full of incredible amounts of information in an hour. The club racing website is incredibly easy to find. BMW CCA clubracing.com. There's a Facebook page. There's an Instagram site, and you can find the schedule. You can find all kinds of contacts, information, rules, classification, anything that you can think of is out there. And so I invite you all to go look. On behalf of M Chapter, I'd like to thank all the participants for tonight. And it was, I thought a great program. It was recorded. We will send the link for the recording out to the M Chapter members, so those that may have missed tonight's call can catch up with it. And I'll end with a reminder of our next webinar is on March 23rd at 8 p.m. Let's talk M cars with EAG. And with that, I will end the program. Thank you, everybody, for a great night. And again, thanks to Scott and Wayne especially.